Welcome back to the ZAO Strength Podcast. This is episode 1700. I have no idea. I don't look. I just book the guests and we get going. Today's episode, we have a very, very special guest. Siba Emin is not the guest, but he is going to be on the episode with us today. And he has recruited his own professor, Dr. Buckner, from the University of South Florida. He has a PhD in exercise science, has published over 100 manuscripts on resistance training adaptations. He got his PhD at University of Mississippi. Apparently, it's a really notorious lab because, you'll learn that what we're going to talk about today might really question how you understand muscle physiology, strength training, blood flow restriction type things. A lot of hot topics in the powerlifting world right now are revolving around how do you get strong? Is muscle the most important thing for strength gains? What about volume? How are we actually supposed to get strong and what does the literature show? So hopefully that's a good intro for you guys. And let's get into the episode. Where I'm at right now in the coaching world is, as we mentioned before the episode, I work with a lot of lifters who their primary goal is to get stronger in the powerlifting context. So on game day, they need to perform to their best of their ability a 1 repetition from an RPE 7.5 to a 10. And I've had a lot of different strategies that I've used with lifters around, in the last 7 years. But I think all coaches kind of have this happen to them where they question if what they're doing is right. Is it, is there a better way to implement training variables for your clients? What happens in edge cases that don't make any sense? There's a constant questioning of what is happening and why. And I imagine that's why you got into literature or the research world. Actually, that might be the first question. How did you get into the very niche world of exercise physiology for your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. So growing up, I was a gymnast, and in high school, I started to get more interested in lifting weights. And my entire senior year, I took weight training. And when it came to, I guess, pick a topic to study in college, all I knew was I like to work out. So I went with an exercise science degree, and I actually studied athletic training because I thought that meant I could study athletes. And what it actually meant is I could wrap ankles. So I quickly changed my degree, but ultimately what I do now, I didn't even know that was an option for a career. Studying skeletal muscle growth and adaptation and asking questions and trying to answer those questions. I had no idea that this was a thing. Eventually I got a master's degree in strength and conditioning, and I had mentors pushing me towards a career in research, a career in science. And I was pretty resistant to that idea because it sounded boring. And I guess with enough push and shove from mentors who cared, I eventually caved in and decided to get a PhD. And, I guess one of the things that made me not want a PhD is I didn't think there was that much more to discover or learn. And probably at the time I was naive and I thought I knew a lot more than I actually knew. And that I thought I understood why we get bigger, why we get stronger. I thought I understood how to program and why we program various ways. And I got really lucky that I had great mentorship that challenged me to think about why I have a certain position. And in a scientific sense, it's, well, what evidence is there for that statement? And the more I got pushed, the more I think we together realized that a lot of what we believe it's not based in any type of evidence. It's based in maybe tradition. It's based in something that people have taught and practiced for a long time, but we don't necessarily know that a lot of these things are true. And once we kind of found out that, okay, the relationship between muscle size and strength isn't what we thought it was, there's just so much questions to answer in that line of inquiry. And then once we question that, it's like, well, okay, then how do you now approach strength training if, our research group tends to think that muscle growth doesn't play a large role in that adaptation? So obviously that has huge implications for how you program for strength. So yeah, it was a road that I didn't ever expect to go down, but I couldn't be happier having the opportunity to run a lab at USF and work with students. And the way I treat my job is we just ask questions and answer them through our study design, and it's way more fun than it sounds like. And I think the students that I get to work with really enjoy that process.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you thought there wasn't any more to like uncover, because as a coach, for the last like 2 years, I kind of felt the same way. And not from like an arrogant perspective, but like I got really into this concept that and I don't mean to throw him under the bus, but Mike would always say, follow the athlete response. And to me, that meant it doesn't matter what any of the literature is publishing, because individuals are going to have a unique response anyway. So just mess around with stuff and see what happens. And I think that that's really valuable, because if you're just dependent on exercise science literature to make all of the decisions that you're making in training or as coaching, if you're coaching clients, that's similarly dogmatic. But I kind of went the other way, where it's like anecdote now is the most useful in this confined, experience working with a lifter. But at the same time, it's dependent on whether or not the initial few strategies we try are effective, because then trust is going to be the biggest limiter in can we keep creating new ideas with them. So, more recently, as ZAO Strength has been growing, we have more clients that are kind of just starting out with us, and clients want to feel like the thing that they're doing is going to lead somewhere successful. And then the more people you work with, you're like, what do I know? Like, do I know anything? And on a more extreme level, and I think Siba and I have talked about this a little bit, we've gone to really depend on athlete feedback, almost to the point of like, hey, athlete B, what do you want to do? Because potentially that's going to be more useful than me trying to plan it out ahead of time and predict your response. And so it's kind of like this similar, I'm currently in this like existential crisis of coaching, where I'm looking back on everything I've done, and I'm like, do I know anything? I'm looking ahead and all this new research, specifically research about like the muscle size being a primary predictor for strength training, for strength outcomes or force production ability. And I don't know, it seems like the popular opinion is that it is the most important variable. And so if that is the case, why have we been doing minimal volume training for some athletes? Like, maybe I missed out on a lot of growth. And so, it's similar. I'm like, now I'm in this place of, okay, I definitely didn't know everything, because I'm currently questioning a lot. So I guess what's your take on those rambles?
I think I had a similar experience, and originally mine came from experience, not from science, because in my master's degree, I read paper abstracts. I didn't read papers like I was supposed to. I think I trained at a pretty high. I wasn't a competitor in the sense of powerlifting or weightlifting, but I trained for world records, like in gymnastics related skills, and I thought I was really good. And it wasn't until I was challenged to question assumptions that I began to realize that not everything I thought had evidence, and not that it always needs evidence, right? But it needs an explanation as to why something occurs. And as I developed my thinking and began to ask myself, okay, why do I assume that this is true? I couldn't always justify the way I was, designing a program or whatever it might be. So I think, and currently we probably come from two different ends of the spectrum. You have a lot of experience through coaching. I have experience as a scientist and researcher, and I conduct training studies. But training studies are very limited because you typically have an 8-week window, and you're trying to induce adaptation and answer a question, and the ability to do that is really limited within an 8-week time frame. And one of the things I think about, and you're probably, I'll use this example because I think you're probably familiar with it, but daily undulating periodization is a good example because these are studies that were conducted that were 8-week long studies, and um, we look at a different order of training, right? So it could be hypertrophy, strength, power, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or it could be a different order of training over 8 weeks. And at the end of that 8 weeks, we see it as changing the order of these training days, the focus of that training day. Does it affect your adaptation? And as I've developed my thinking, I used to think, okay, you should train strength farthest away from hypertrophy so your muscles aren't fatigued, so you can lift stronger on that day. So at the end of 8 weeks, you're going to be stronger. But as my thinking has evolved, I now think you could design that same study, but just take the hypertrophy day out altogether. In over 8 weeks, it's not going to matter. Strength, I believe strength would be the same if you completely remove that day. So sometimes you get caught up arguing the order of these days when I think, honestly, I think in those studies, you could remove the hypertrophy day, strength would be the same. You might even be able to remove the power day and just do the strength one time a week for 8 weeks. I think it would be the same between groups, which means that a lot of these 8-week studies have a very limited ability to inform our opinions about training, because over 8 weeks, it's hard to really see separation in these groups. Yet, from what I've experienced and learned, when these studies are published, they do sometimes have a big impact on how we think about training, how we go about our training. But to your point on,
I was going to say that study in particular, was that what, 20? I think there's a Zordo study. Is that the one you're referencing?
So yeah, he has a few, but the one I'm thinking about is from the Zoros lab of daily undulating periodization. Yeah.
I just remember that one being like, whoa, guys, you can just do the HSP, and it's got to be squat, bench, and deadlift. And the order is really important. And like, you do that, you get stronger. And to the degree where I literally like would write programs like that. And I thought, hey, you're going to get stronger. This is what the study says. Give it to 10 people. Run it for longer than 8 weeks, because if you're working with the client, hopefully you're working with longer than 2 months. There's no consistency at all in their performance outcomes. Some of them responded well, some of them didn't respond at all. Some of them got injured, and it's like, okay, strike one against relying all on one study to justify your coaching decisions. But yeah, I just wanted to say that one is huge. And then like there are a few others, probably a lot of others that you mentioned, like how they make a big impact on how coaches start or strength and conditioning coaches start implementing things for their clients.
And the thing, I don't want to stay on this point too long, but when it's 8 weeks, right, you could take that same study and just insert a separate group. And like I said, I think you could get away with lifting heavy once a week and have same strength adaptation over 8 weeks. But if we do a cleaner design and just add a group that does a 3RM on Monday, a 3RM on Tuesday, and a 3RM on Friday, or a 4, 5, 2, just low volume lifting heavy. And I think 10 out of 10 times you run that study, that strength in that group will be just as good. And they had no hypertrophy day, no power day. They just had a low volume strength program. And, I think kind of thinking that way is important, because if you're weighing the value of this 8-week study very heavily, you have to think about, okay, what was the goal of that 8-week study? It was to maximize strength. And then you have to think, is there better ways we could maximize strength over that 8 weeks? Maybe. Or were all components of the study important for strength over that 8 weeks? And I think that's just one really good example.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking of big studies, the one that has thrown me for a loop in the last month is one that Greg Knuckles didn't publish it, but he posted it on his blog um, about whether or not neurological adaptations are important for strength gains, because of the idea that noob gains are primarily neurological, and that has been the assumption for a long time. And they, if I understand the study correctly, that they used to kind of, well, that Greg presented to disagree with that statement, was a biceps curl like maximum, where, you know, it was all trained lifters from my understanding, or it was trained versus untrained. I think it was all trained lifters, and they did like a maximum force bicep curl, like I think a single arm concentration curl or something, like on a machine. And if I'm interpreting it properly, maybe, have you seen this study that I'm talking about?
So I know he posted something that I actually commented on, where it was making the suggestion that neural adaptations aren't occurring in the latter. If you're trained, you're not really having these robust neural adaptations. Is that kind of the premise of his post?
So I think with the study, the correlation was that as muscle size increases, force production increased pretty much linearly in the study that they were describing, or like just demonstrating. And so over like 4 or 6 weeks or something, actually I don't know the next step of that. I don't know what happened in the longer term, but the conclusion that was drawn, at least, and this is where my lack of like science, like not lack of science, but like scientific research is limiting me sometimes. But the conclusion was muscle growth and size is more predictive of force production than the neurological adaptations that you get from something like a bicep curl. But then the implication is, so take that for a squat, bench, and deadlift as well, because now you're limiting the difficulty of the movement. And if neurological adaptations are occurring to increase muscle fiber recruitment, you'd see that with a bicep curl, because that's part of the, it's eliminating the skill part, basically.
Yeah, I think a bicep curl model definitely limits the skill component. And it also allows us to, with pretty good accuracy, measure growth, because it's a small muscle that we have a really good ability to measure. So a bicep curl model is often what's used in research, and it gets criticized quite a bit because a powerlifter doesn't really care about bicep curl strength. But a lot of the times it's just a model to try to understand adaptation. To go back to that paper, now I was looking on here to see if I could find the post. Trained lifters are primarily stronger due to muscularity, not neural adaptations. I think that is the one. And if I can, I'll get in my own head here if I can find my comment. Okay. Yeah, that study was cross-sectional in nature. So they took a group of people and they did measurements. And my problem with that interpretation of that study, which suggested that the trained individuals aren't experiencing neural adaptations, is they had one marker for what neural adaptations meant. And I would be really hesitant to suggest that all neural adaptations could ever be captured by one measurement in a study, right? Because the activation of muscle is such a complex process. We have our brain sending signals to our muscle, which gets transmitted into the muscle cell. And there's several steps along the way where adaptation can occur. And what no one's been able to do, and I think this is pretty fascinating, no one's been able to demonstrate in research that you need an increase in the size of your muscle to get stronger. It's never been demonstrated. And I know that sounds kind of odd, but no one's ever shown that you cannot get strength without having growth. And in trained people, the suggestion is, if you've been training, let's just call it 2-3 years, the suggestion is that the primary reason you get stronger is because your muscles get bigger. But at the same time, we know that people who've been training for 2 to 3 years are going to grow less than someone who just started training. You see what I'm saying? So you experience less growth as you're trained, yet we suggest that as you're trained, it's the most important reason as to why you get stronger. In fact, some researchers have suggested that there's a plateau in muscle growth that happens pretty early on, after which it's really difficult to get an increase in the size of your muscle. So I think the idea and discussion is really, really fascinating because, we did a study, I guess it's about a year ago now, and we had two groups train. One group just did a 1RM, and they did a 1RM twice a week. So if you do a 1 repetition max, just lift as much weight as you can one time, you won't grow, but you'll get stronger. And these were trained people we recruited. So when you recruit trained people, you assume the primary reason they get stronger is because they get bigger, if you listen to the wisdom of your textbook, right? The other group lifted traditional hypertrophy training. So they did 70% of their 1RM, so a weight you can lift 10 to 12 times. So they did that for, I think it was 8 weeks' time. And one group grew, the other group did not grow. And then for 4 weeks, they both tried to just maximize strength by doing a 1RM twice a week. So the theory there would be the group that had growth would have a greater potential for strength when they tried to really drive their strength upward. And even in trained individuals, we were not able to demonstrate that a group that got bigger had a greater potential to get stronger than a group that had no growth. Does that make sense? So
did you find that the group that got, did you find that the 70% of 1RM group actually demonstrated increases in size as well?
They did, yeah. So they had an increase in size. Now, over 8 weeks, it's not robust, right? But they did grow, and it was significant, yet strength was the same. And the one group over the entire 12 weeks never had any growth. And I think that study, we conducted it, we designed it, and I think it's full of limitations, right? Because all we can conclude is that 8 weeks of growth does not appear to enhance strength. But I think a question that Sebastian might ask is, well, what about 6 months of growth? Does that enhance your strength? Right? What about a year of growth? Does that enhance your strength? And honestly, that's something that we don't have an answer to. And it's controversial to say that I don't think it would play a big role, even over a year. But at the very least, it's fascinating that nobody has that data. And no one can say, we have evidence that the primary reason, let's say over 1 year's time, that you'll get stronger is because you grow. And I would be pretty confident to make the suggestion that even as you're trained, and even if you think growth does play a role in making you stronger, I don't think it's the primary reason you get stronger when you're trained. And I'll say the primary reason I think that that's true is because once you're trained, you just do not grow a lot. It's very underwhelming how much you grow if you're a natural athlete. Yet we know you can keep getting stronger and stronger. And that to me is just a really fascinating idea to toss around in your mind, because the story we tell, I don't think makes a lot of sense in its current form. Just some thought.
What I find very interesting in that context is I'm not claiming to know what is the reason that we get stronger, that I know how we get stronger in that sense. But relating to Jim's thought about bottom-up programming and following the athlete response, since I've been coaching now for 8 years, I thought individual programming, there's a lot of differences. The longer I coached, the more I realized that the differences are actually way bigger than I thought. And I just had my meet, and we were talking on Wednesday yesterday about how I programmed for the meet. And it's fascinating to see that there's some people who literally do hyper-specific training in a way that they almost do RP9, RP10 singles in the main lifts, and they get super strong with it. Like they become like more and more elite, especially the French lifters now, like almost like just SBD days, like just heavy stuff. I'm not saying that's the only thing they do, but it's like it's pretty specific strength only training. And the funny thing is, I remember like Jim used to be my coach like 2 years ago, and we were prepping on a competition, and that was kind of like the style I trained, or at least it was like higher intensity, what you would normally do. And I would just get progressively weaker. Like, I remember I talked to him and we were like, what the hell is going on? Like, I train heavy, it's high intensity work, and I get weaker. And then the last week before the meet, we were just like, you know what? Like, let's just completely change the paradigm and like do like a high volume training. We will keep a heavy single, but do like high volume training. And my estimated 1 rep max jumped over 100 pounds in 1 week, which was insane. And I'm not saying, you know, obviously like the high volume did lead to hypertrophy, and that's why I'm stronger in the meat.
Right. But 1 week later.
Yeah, one week later, I just gained an inch on my quads, and all of a sudden I'm stronger. But the interesting thing for me is that I'm like, well, I really feel like intensity is not the only variable influencing strength, because I've seen many people, you know, where I felt like volume for them was almost like the better predictor for strength progress than intensity was. And as I said, I'm not saying that is because of the hypertrophy component, but I'm saying like, I'm really confused, you know, because now I went into the meet with way more volume than I usually would do in the last weeks before the meet, lower intensities I would normally do. And it was by far the best I've ever felt in a meet setting. And that makes me really curious thinking about like first of all, why is that? And second of all, maybe does that like lead to like some kind of like different adaptations, you know, like maybe even like different neural adaptations, that some people need more volume to get different neural adaptations. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but yeah, I feel like within that there's like a lot of stuff which needs to be discovered, and the intensity narrative in that context sometimes is also something where I'm kind of like still feeling there's something off, you know, if that makes sense. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but yeah, I'm just super surprised because I've seen people on both ends of the spectrum, and I would even say like very elite lifters, you can kind of almost see that they're not really growing anymore. Like they're staying in a weight class. They maybe get a little bit leaner, you know, but some of them like increased over the last 5 years, Jim, there have been so many lifters who literally increased their relative points by 100, you know, like who have maybe had like 480 Wilks. Now they have a 580 Wilks. They're in the same weight class, you know, but they're literally way better lifters. And I would agree with you, Dr. Buckner, from an anecdotal standpoint. Like I'm obviously not in a literature setting, but from an anecdotal standpoint, that I'm like, it just doesn't make sense to me that it is all related to muscle mass.
Teen lifters are also a huge like question mark for me in the muscle mass camp, because it's like, yeah, you're bigger because you're younger and you're still new and you're probably getting some muscle adaptations, but you're like 70 kilos or 60, you know what I mean? You're like 65 kilos pulling over 750 pounds. Like, obviously there's like my understanding is like the difference between like fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers might have an impact on like your 1 rep max. I don't really know, but explain me that. You know what I mean? Like, you just started and you're beating like total level lifts that haven't been broken in almost a few decades, and all. Now you're here as a 17, 18-year-old kid at teen nationals, like pulling something I've been trying to get my whole training career, and I'm bigger than you, you know, like, so then what gives?
Those are all really interesting questions. So I guess to Sebastian's point first, for one, I think we should take a look at what was going on there, because that rapid increase, right? is really curious, because there's nothing that would explain 100-pound increase, in a week's time,
The, the,
um, unless something was extremely off.
this,
So that one I'd have to think about, and I do think there's a certain amount of practice that's necessary to facilitate strength. But I do think we don't completely understand everything, and I think this is going to be a tangent, but I think it's an interesting and worthwhile one.
Mm-hmm.
I do find it interesting that all of us possess strength that we can't access, right? So none of us can access all of our strength our muscles are capable of producing voluntarily, right? Um, so is adding muscle alone enough to bypass that, or is there some limitation by our connective tissue that we don't fully understand? Because I think it's interesting to think about. Sebastian, I talk about that study in class all the time, where they would do different tasks to decrease inhibition, right? So they drink one shot of whiskey, decrease inhibition, their strength would increase. I mean, this study was from the 50s. You'd never do this today, but they would fire a shotgun behind their head to scare them, and someone would get a huge sympathetic response. And what strength do? It shot up, right? So you can't we know you can't voluntarily access all of your strength potential, and it's likely because you're going to injure yourself if you do, right? And oftentimes we see that's what happens. If someone's faced with a circumstance where they have to access extra strength to save their life, oftentimes they're able to do it, but they walk away with an injury. Their muscles, their connective tissues pulled off the bone. So I think on some level we are limited by our connective tissue and how strong we can be, and maybe some of what you're talking about could be explained by differences not only in characteristics of the muscle, but also maybe in characteristics of the connective tissue of the individuals, whereby you cannot perfectly understand the story of how strong they are by how much muscle mass they present at a surface level. And then I'll add a third layer, and these are just things I think about, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have answers for all of it, because honestly, I don't think anybody has all these answers. I think a lot of people might have thoughts on these things, but I think that there's also, you'll hear the term muscle quality or muscle maturity. There's these terms that are thrown around, but we never get into a deeper meaning of what does that actually mean. And there's a very, very small handful of papers that suggest that the proximity of actin and myosin, which are the components of muscle that actually produce the force, might be different in elite level powerlifters compared to the average recreational athlete. Which, does that mean the muscle does in fact get more dense? Now, I don't think we have enough evidence to make a strong conclusion on that, but it's an intriguing idea, because I certainly think there's things that we don't fully comprehend at this point in time, regarding how do we conceptualize and understand everything that underlies getting stronger, or differences between individuals.
One thing to follow up maybe for a second is because we also talked about fatigue in class, and just like totally subjective right now, but it's like whenever I do high intensity work, I feel like trash immediately. It's like I can do it once in a meet, like just let me lift once heavy in a meet and then I'm good. Interesting thing is I can get a lot of training in high quality training, not with super light weights, but a little bit less, and I don't feel like trash. And that's like maybe thinking about the whole inhibition stuff too, which you just like mentioned. But in general, it's just like I feel so much better with like if I have more volume in my training, and then I can just go to the high intensity realm like once in the meet. Whereas if I do like the high intensity stuff all the time, like even if I pull back tremendously on my volume, I just feel literally like weak and achy. Like that's how I walk around. I'm like, damn, like I'm getting weaker and I'm fatigued. Like I don't even know how that works. But yeah, I find it very, very interesting.
So I think, another thing that we have to acknowledge is that very little of the principles of the scientific literature, right, can apply to you, Sebastian. But your strength is nowhere near the mean strength in the majority of the literature, right? You've exceeded that drastically. So I do think there's a difference in, the what you'd be lifting on a heavy day compared to a, recreationally or even a well-trained individual. I don't think you can necessarily compare the stress ever of, squatting 225 pounds, which let's be fair, that's probably average strength might be, hitting 3, but when you take a percentage of that as a training load, it's much different than lifting, 500-600 pounds, right? And I don't want to insult you if I should have said 700-800 pounds, right? I know you just killed it at that meet. But, and what are the consequences to the connective tissue of putting yourself through that movement with that much load, right? Because having that level of strength isn't without consequence. It's a tremendous stress. So maybe there is a low volume approach that would work similar to your high volume approach. And I would wonder, so I'm just wondering out loud, I don't know if this is true, but you said you started doing some, higher volume work. I would wonder, could you do those loads, but reduce the volume, right? So the weights are lighter because the volume's higher, right? But I would personally wonder, could you take those same intensities or those same loads, but reduce the volume even within that and still get the same strength, right? And in our lab, it's obviously premature, but we have some data that would suggest that strength actually might increase pretty similarly if you push those sets really hard, or even if you didn't push those sets really hard. And it's obviously it's a premature thought, but it's a still forming thought. But I do wonder, if there are more conservative approaches that would also work, right? And maybe, I think there's also something to be said about, you might enjoy that grind of really pushing it, even with these relatively lighter loads, right? But maybe there's an individual who doesn't, or depending on the other stressors in life, there might be times where you want to lift a relatively lighter load and you want to keep it farther away from failure, right?
Yeah.
And can you do that and still increase strength? I think you can. Is it as optimal? Maybe, but it's like, premature to make that suggestion. And you both know that there's going to be so much variability within your clientele that you're never going to draw a strong conclusion. You're just going to say, okay, we might be able to get away with less and still succeed.
I'm like it's like I'm talking to a mirror and you're in my brain, but you have a lot more things to say because you know more, or you have more like direct experience. Like I said, I just have anecdote with clients, and I also have anecdote with myself. And one of the things that got me into coaching was because I felt like almost every alpha, like the alpha bros who are also powerlifters. And to be fair, Siba, like you don't have the alpha masculinity, like toxic part, but you are that person that can just grind and thinks they need to grind. And like, because when Siba started working with me, I gave him less volume than he's like ever had in his life. And he's like, dude, what is this? And I'm like, I think it's fine. And he was like, okay, let me show you what I was working with, because I think he was working with Ryan Doris. And then look at what you gave me. And I'm like, Yeah, that's like a 70% reduction in like volume compared to what you're used to. And to his credit, it was working for him. And what I was proposing was brand new. And we kind of ended up finding more of a middle ground, I think, from where he started. And that challenged my narrative as well, because I, as an athlete, have a very conservative approach with my own training due to my previous psychological history with injury, like not history, but how I perceive lifts impact my fear response.
Mhm.
So I'm very conservative with like adding new things because I know how quickly in the past I've had injuries with training or just fatigue. I had like 3-year bout of SI pain and I had no idea how to fix that. And so I'm just very aware of like total stress on my body. And so for clients that typically respond really well to my training biases, they're like, wait, we don't have to do everything and I can still get stronger. And I'm like, yeah. And you have more time with your kids. You have more time to like enjoy, life outside of the gym. You don't have to go to the gym 4 days a week. You could go 3 days a week. How novel of an idea. And I think it becomes really toxic in even in the competitive sense to assume that you must sacrifice every day of the week a certain amount of hours a day in order to quote unquote optimize your strength. And that leads to a secondary thought, and it's more recent and updated, is that the psychological preferences of the lifter tend to, if they can understand what they are, because not every athlete knows, hey, I want to do this. I think they want to do what I think is good. But if I can, and Steve and I talked about this, and our whole coaching staff talked about it yesterday. If we can, encourage lifters to think more critically about their preferences and their previous training experiences to kind of find this magical block, it's going to change because desires change over time. But it seems like when we lend our creativity towards their intuition, they happen to respond really well.
Mhm.
And I think that's really scary as a coach if you come from the camp of, size precedes strength. So that's how we write the training. And it's kind of what you were, it somewhat related to not being able to unlock the strength because we have some limiter. Well, what is that limiter? And Data Driven Strength actually made a post about like the muscle limiter, or like what is the strength limiter? Is it like technique? Is it not having enough muscle? Is it something else? I didn't dig into it too hard, but I like that idea because I think that limiter changes based on context of your training.
And it might be related to your overall fatigue status, even, right? So you might protect yourself more when you are in a fatigue state, and maybe that was some of what Sebastian was experiencing. So maybe you just downregulate your ability to maximally express your strength at a given time. One thing I'll add, because I think it relates to this conversation, and we can redirect it if we want to, but I think it does make sense to mention here, um, because one of the themes that we're kind of touching on with the psychological aspect, and when you're talking about balancing your life, right, and spending time with your family and kids, and earlier we talked about periodization, right? We gave an example of daily undulating periodization, but I actually don't think that's periodization. I think that's just programming.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a pretty deep dive in my career on what periodization is, and um, I think if you're considering stress in an individual's life, and physical, emotional, work, school, and you're balancing that and considering that when you're developing your programming, I think that's the essence of what periodization was meant to be. Because a lot of people don't realize that periodization was developed in the context of sport, right? So a lot of people across a training program will decrease volume and they'll increase intensity, right? You've probably heard of that technique. You start off hypertrophy, which is high volume. You transition to strength, which is lower volume. But traditional periodization, the reason that happened is because, for example, across that same period of time, they were not playing football, and now they've started preseason football, and now they're in season. So the time spent playing football has increased. So naturally, you have to decrease your volume lifting weights to counterbalance it. So it's stress management, right? When your only stressor, your only physical stressor is lifting, right? Periodization almost simply becomes stress management, which can take so many different forms, right? So a lot of people think variation is what makes something, quote, periodized. But I think what makes something periodized, if we want to hold ourselves to that word or term, because it's a very popular word and term, I think it means that we're doing our best to manage stress in our programming, right? Or across, the training block or the several training blocks, to avoid overtraining and in an attempt to peak their performance on game day or on competition day. And I think a lot of those things we were mentioning, those themes, are actually what makes something, quote, periodized.
That's so cool because I subconsciously, that's what bottom up training has kind of led me towards, or coaching. I never really know how to say it. Bottom up periodization, it's led me towards that, because when you're eliciting feedback, both subjective and objective feedback from athletes, and you're using that information to make training decisions, it's not just like, okay, this is the information that we need so we can optimize the block now. I mean, I don't think about that. It's like, okay, your legs are hurting today or this week, or I'm noticing a trend in like tendonitis expression. So perhaps the stress of the upper body is too high right now. And now we need to either pivot entirely, move into like a pivot or a deload, or potentially just reduce the stress of the week and keep going. That's another topic about like deloading and pivoting and like the necessity of those or whatever. But we'll probably have another episode on that. But the thing is, it's like, I think the reason why a lot of my clients have had successes in the past is because that is the most important thing to me, is the stress management. And it's like, I think athletes beat themselves up for pulling things back, like mentally. I think they're like, I can't do that. How will I get stronger if I pull things back? I've adapted to this, and now I should be able to do it, but I can't. And if I do less, then I'll get weaker. And luckily, having a coach, I just say, no, I don't think so. I've seen it happen in the contrary. So let's go with it. But I think people even probably quit without coaching or with the wrong information, because maybe their life gets too chaotic for what they think is too chaotic. And now they think they can't get stronger because of misunderstandings of the data and the literature on what actually is required to get stronger.
I think so. And, I always mention this in class as well, because if you're getting a master's in exercise science, not all the time, but you take a poll and say, who here likes to lift, right? And usually everyone raises their hand, which is not normal to begin with. And then you can ask who lifts for at least 1 hour every day. You'll get a lot of hands. You can ask who lifts 2 hours, and you'll get way more hands than you'd ever get. And people who thrive and enjoy this, there's almost and I don't want to blanket that this is everybody, but there's a mentality and obsession. Like if I take a day off, it happened to me the other night, and I realized it was midnight, and I was going to go to the gym, and I was tired. I was upgrading. I was like, why don't I just take the night off? Like this is of zero consequence, in the grand scheme. But I think the psychological dependence sometimes is way more than we realize. And I try to recruit people for my studies even. And it'll be an 8-week study where I say, you cannot train your biceps outside of my study, right? And our protocols may not be ideal for growth, People are scared to give up bicep curls for 8 weeks because they're scared they're going to lose muscle. But we know that you can maintain your muscle mass on pretty low volume, where at the very least, we may not grow your muscle for 8 weeks, but your muscle will probably be the same size at the end. I don't think you're going to lose muscle. And if you lose it, it's going to come back very quickly once you return to your normal lifting. And these are things that I believe are all true, but getting people in, and even myself, I know the data as good as anybody, but it's still very difficult sometimes to accept them as, okay, I know this is true. Could I give up a week if I needed to and know that everything's okay? And even if I lose muscle, I probably won't. But if I lose a little bit of muscle, it's going to come back quick. If I lose a little bit of strength, I actually doubt I would. I might come back stronger even. But psychologically, sometimes it's very hard to come to grips with these things.
And sometimes you have to wait to. There's a phrase, and I don't know where it comes from, but it's like your brain needs proof, not promises. I don't know if you've heard this before, and I use it. I don't try to use it too much because I hate slogans like that. But when it comes to stuff like this, I've always liked to, well, maybe not like to, but it's like my brain won't let me do anything other than learn the hard way. And it's because I want to test it. I don't even care. I mean, I hope I'm right. And everyone else might tell me I'm wrong, and there might already be evidence to say that I'm wrong. But I think there might be more to it. So let's test it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And, clients also have their own autonomy with training too. So on one hand, from a coaching perspective, they want to let go of some of their autonomy. Usually, I mean, I think that's what they think they're supposed to do, is let go of the autonomy, let the coach direct it. And I think people get surprised. And I think, Siba, you've talked about this before, where they sign up and I'm trying to get as much data as possible. And secretly, I'm trying to get them to visualize their previous training experiences. Because I find that the lifters that have the most trouble getting stronger, and usually just the most frustration with training, have a really difficult time like visualizing and empathizing with what a future training session may or may not feel like. Because they're so, well, I can't say why, but one hypothesis might be they're just really into the numbers and the objective like outcome. And then like, I don't really care how that happened. It happened. So sure, I'll do the work. Like, especially when I worked with RTS, the amount of people who would sign up and say, I will do as much as I need to get stronger. I'll do whatever it takes. Mm-hmm. And I always got really nervous because it's like, I'm biased towards you probably don't need very much. They're excited about doing a lot. And then I'm simultaneously nervous that too much might break them, mm-hmm. And so I'm like, where do I give them everything that they want, or do I pull back? And, at some point they might just have to learn through their own experience. But then where is my role as a coach play in with my own experience? Especially if the data about what we're supposed to do is kind of murky, if everything kind of works at some point,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think oftentimes, people want all the answers and they want the most optimal evidence-based program, which I think, if we're honest, I don't think that exists, right? Even though that might be what they're seeking or what they think they're going to get, whereas you're going to get informed practice. And maybe sometimes as a coach, you have to act as just the governor to rein it in a little bit and try to control it and realize that, well, what they need out of this, in addition to getting strong, because oftentimes it's not just about strength, it's about a lifestyle, and it's about mental health, and it's about these other things. They need that aspect too. And maybe that requires them to do this much volume because that's what they need, and they're not willing to sacrifice it. So yeah, I think that is a reality of working with individuals. The one thing I'll add on to strength that I think is just fascinating to think about is in the literature, detraining is something that's studied quite often. So they'll train people for 8, 12 weeks, sometimes even 6 months, and then they'll detrain them, help them do nothing for 2 months. And they're interested often at looking at both muscle size and strength. And I think people would be, they would enjoy knowing that those detraining studies typically, not often, but somewhat often, fail to see anything happen negative with strength. And the reason is they'll test their strength every month to see if they're getting weaker. And just testing their strength in those detraining studies once a month is enough to maintain their strength, which means it might be hard to get stronger, but maintaining your strength is sometimes you're going to accidentally do it because you had exposure. Minimal practice might be enough to maintain a lot of it, right? And if that is low volume, that's going to promote recovery, and you're going to come back and you might likely lose a little bit of tissue, but in those studies, it doesn't seem to affect your strength. The tissue will come back. And then once you get back onto employing some progressive overload, strength should increase if you're capable of increasing strength.
So I'm going to ask a question that kind of is more like a student asking a professor if their exam is if you're gonna get an A on your essay. But I wrote a post on Instagram the other day about my thoughts on this narrative that you need to do singles. So as a powerlifter, your goal is to get good at a single out of 10. Basically, that's the ultimate goal. And I think the logical conclusion there is then you should be training singles as often as you can to practice what that means as a powerlifter, i.e. just adhering to like specificity. But the other, I think the experience that I've had as coaching is that I've had plenty of clients that don't even touch anything above like a three reps with like two RIR, which is still intense, right? But I think some people would think, well, it's not above 90%. Like you're missing out on some technical adaptation that would be required. And sure, maybe. But my argument is it's powerlifting, and the deviation from specificity that we're experiencing when we're doing like a set of 5 at an RPE 8 or 9, I don't think is that much different technically, physiologically, and more so, whatever the reason to shift is probably psychological for the lifter, and preferentially treating their desires and what they're feeling is going to feel better and get them excited to train or whatever as a justification to say, like, if that's the thing we're doing year round, you're probably good. We just need maybe the only exposure we need is on the competition to a single, and like that's good for you. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because like on one hand, you mentioned like low volume, high intensity, like doing a higher intensity style of training without like the volume for growth. And I don't think the reason is because more volume is going to get them stronger. I think it's more to do with their psychological relationship with the intensity. I had lifters that just get so amped up at the single at an 8 and also reflect on how that impacts their identity as a powerlifter. And so like the fluctuations in strength that are probably natural are so much more like knives in their back when they're down, and then like a cocaine hit when they're up. You know what I mean? And that's pretty significant differences on a week-to-week basis, and I don't think they can sustain it. So if it's not required, mm-hmm. then why do it at all?
Yeah, I think we don't currently know how narrow it needs to be, like how specific the intensity has to be. I would tend to think like sets of 10 to 12 would be a little, maybe it's going to be beneficial, but maybe wouldn't be as beneficial as reducing it to 5. But going lower than that, I don't have data that I could speak to how big of a difference that would make. We do know that the more complex the movement, the more specific in general you want to be. So all that means is a lot of the research is, like we said, in a bicep curl model. In a bicep curl, you can lift 10, 12, 15, or you could do a 1RM, and they all pretty much give you the same strength. We know a bench press is more complex, and there's a study that bench press needed some more heavy lifting to actually increase bench press in a way that might be considered optimal. But then, after that, it's really kind of an unknown as far as research informing us, and I think that's where y'all have the better information because it just doesn't exist. There's a few studies out of James Steele and James Fisher's labs that looked at some low volume approaches and had similar success to higher volume approaches. And I think like this practice the test mentality. But just because something works for one person doesn't mean it's necessary or the best way, right? So could you, I don't know, in your example, would you say never going heavier than a 5 RM intensity? Would that be?
Yeah. Well, for the one lifter I was describing, the one that like we literally, for his lower body lifts, his squat and deadlift, we didn't go below 5 at an 8. If we did lower reps, it would be like RP6, so like effective intensity would be around a 5 RM. I remember specifically we did 6 at an 8 for his deadlift and a 6 or 5 at an 8 for his squat for the 3-4 week block leading into his competition. And then we implemented what I call like a flipped week for his taper, where we put the ending week exercises at the beginning, and then his beginning, his comp lifts were at the end because that's when his meet was. And conversely, okay, so that was his best meet of his life by far. Conversely, I went with more of a traditional model for the biggest competition of his life, which was Worlds.
Yeah.
Where we, brought the volume down, increased the intensity, did singles and doubles. I estimated one rep max was dropping, but my justification was that's because the difference between your 6 RM and your 1 RM is just narrower. And so like we're getting a more accurate picture and it's a bigger drop. But then like he's actually handling loads on his singles for less than he was handling on his 6s. And it's too close to the meet. Like we're a week out. Damn. Hopefully this taper works.
Yeah.
It didn't.
Yeah.
And he was devastated, and I was too. And I was like, you guys are wrong. Like whoever told me that was the thing to do, you're wrong because it didn't happen. And this matter is my job, and he's crying. And I'm like, okay. And that was, I think, the moment where I had to recognize that my role as a coach is not to emulate the data, emulate like the most common practice for all lifters and just apply it. But more so, what do you think, man? Like, you feeling good with these singles? To almost a detriment sometimes, where I'm like asking my lifters every session, how did it feel? And they're like, I felt fine. And I'm like, okay, fine. You know what I mean? So yeah, that long answer to your question.
And I think, go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing I can speak to, because I've been an extremely neurotic lifter, like training up to 40 hours a week and doing everything optimal. Is like, honestly, like the what you said, Dr. Buckner, about like inhibition, I feel like that is a metaphor which can be used for a lot of things, because if you're extremely neurotic, you have a lot of like self-inhibition sometimes. And there are like, certain emotions which can actually carry performance, negative emotions, like fear and all of that, but only to a certain point, because you can burn out from them. And then when you go into the training session, you're kind of like, I really don't want to do this. Your willpower only has a certain point to like push you. But once you're like burned out, you're just like, leave me alone, And I feel like that's where like this like intuition comes in, and asking the lifter what they want to do, because fun fact is, I always had my best perform. Like retrospectively thinking, when I had my best training weeks were weeks where I was feeling emotionally very well. So I was very neurotic. And then let's say for whatever reason, something happened, like I got acceptance into grad school, whatever, like something relieved me. And all of a sudden my training exploded. And that was due to like positive emotions, right? So I find that very interesting because I feel like intuition sometimes serves that. If you're as a coach ask your athlete, like what do you want to actually do? Because a lot of people don't allow themselves to do what they enjoy, like if you give them that permission, all of a sudden it almost feels like a lot of like inhibition is dropping away. Like they go into the gym, like let's say squat a set of 8, and they're like firing at that set of 8 and move the same loads they used to, squat for a set of 4, which is fascinating to me, but that was just like,
the mind's power over strength is something that's very interesting, right? And at least by me, not super well understood, but it's certainly powerful. So maybe just having that ability to do something you love, even if it may not be the most optimal way, right? Maybe that's going to lead to the most intense training or the most motivated training, which maybe that's going to enhance the overall adaptation of the program. And one thing I'll say, because our lab was one of the first labs to demonstrate that you got similar strength doing a 1RM for 8 weeks or doing a 12RM for 8 weeks, essentially. And we've shown this several times. And I think sometimes that gets confused as, okay, the way you should train is do a 1RM as often as possible, right? But the purpose of our study, and this is just an interesting thing about how science works. We designed that study because we wanted to know if having a condition with growth led to greater strength in a condition that did not have growth, right? So it's a different question entirely than what's the ideal way to program. And the thing of it is you can get away with a lot of things for 8 or 12 weeks to try to get proof of concept for an idea. And so often that's what research is doing. It's providing a proof of concept, and it allows you to make a conclusion over 8 or 12 weeks. This leads to similar adaptations in strength as this. But it doesn't necessarily say, for everybody should do this or everybody should do that. Maybe it provides the flexibility that, okay, if we're in this range and we're employing progressive overload and we're managing stress, it seems likely that there is a wide range of things that can probably get you stronger. Now we have to somehow find what's the best recipe for you, following these principles that we seem to understand. And I think the unfortunate thing is we can't say, well, this is better than this, right? Because that low volume approach you use could very well be how one athlete really excels and has the best competition of their life, right? Whereas it didn't work with the athlete you were just referencing. But we still have data to suggest that in some people it does work, right? So I think that kind of speaks to what you've mentioned all throughout this podcast, is that different things seem to work for different athletes, and on paper they would all lead to a similar outcome, but in practice they simply don't. And I think science is a ways away from understanding exactly why one athlete will program in this way and or periodize it, however, whatever word you want to use for it, and another person could use the same program and not fail, but maybe fail to achieve their best.
That reminds me about the study we had in class where where they had like the 3-week period where they didn't train and the one group trained consistently throughout the whole time period. And that's a study which gets, at least in the industry, cited very often for this whole like idea of like sensitization and desensitization and all of that, right? But I feel like the study actually didn't prove that if you like have periods with like, I don't know, like less training or whatever, like technically you can make more progress in general as an athlete. Like for me, it was more like, okay, it's pretty cool because it probably shows that if you go on vacation for 2 weeks, you don't need to be worried if you come back, and just like train where you've left off, And it's just interesting sometimes how people like seeing those studies jump to certain conclusions which are based on the question from the study are actually not what they were looking for, right?
Yeah. No, and that happens a lot, right? I think people see one conclusion, and maybe it's supported by a sentence in that paper, or at a surface level, maybe it seems supported. But yeah, I think we do that very often with research studies when we're trying, and it's everybody I think has great intentions with these things, right? They want to learn and they want to apply this information. Okay, how can I use this? And yeah, I don't think anybody would like, instead of training over this 6 months, I'm going to take every 2 months, I'm going to take 3 weeks off. Well, maybe some people have to because they travel for work, but that wouldn't be the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study would be, to answer a very specific question over a very specific time frame on a specific exercise, right? And then that informs us, okay, a powerlifter is pushing their strength to the very limits, right, of their capability. Was everybody in the study, was that where everyone was at? No, right? And were they performing, the 3 lifts that you perform in power? No, right? So you can already say, all right, this doesn't perfectly apply. What can I extract and take away? Right. And Sebastian, I think that's what you're doing with that study is you're saying, no, I don't think you would prep anybody to compete using this strategy. Yeah. But it does mean that if I got sick and had, or was forced for some, whatever reason it might be, to take time off, that I can get back on track and maybe the consequences won't be as bad as I thought they would be. But maybe there would still be some, even though there wasn't any in the study, because an advanced lifter is in a very different situation than somebody who habitually lifts weights, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're both trained, but I'm resistance trained right now. I lift every week, most days of the week, but I'm not trying to maximize my strength on any lift, right? And if I were, it'd be a different story. My training would look different. My current strength level would be different, but for a study purpose, I'm resistance trained.
I would even say that it is kind of like a misinterpretation of the study from some people, because when you look at the study, they end up at the same point, right? And a lot of people use that study in a way of almost like, oh, if you employ that method, you end up at a higher point because you have a higher rate of change once you're like sensitized to your training again. So I feel like that is just an assumption which is not proven whatsoever.
So you're saying like they extrapolate, like if you did this over, we see that quite a bit, right? They'll end up with the same strength, same muscle size, and they'll say, well, the rate of change, and it doesn't work that way because adaptation is not linear.
Yeah.
And, it's set point's not the correct word, but, if you've already been there, I feel like getting back, reacquiring strength you've already realized, I think is different than new strength adaptation, if that makes sense. And reattaining the muscle tissue the muscle size that you've already experienced, I also think is different than acquiring new hypertrophy or new growth, right? So yeah, I think it would be easy to conflate those things. And that's one example, but several interpretations. I've seen a similar story as that. That's a great point.
I have a training study potential. It could be a training study. It could be just something I try to implement with my lifters. I don't know. But you've heard of MRV, I imagine, maximal recoverable volume or minimal effective volume or whatever you want to use, which, just for those wondering, I think are really cool ideas. But like, how, in what world could you determine whether or not you're correct for any of those things? You'd have to really be just jumping around with volume levels to see what MRV is. But I have an idea that I think is a little easier to implement. I've been thinking about this on the podcast. The concept is like it's maximum effective intensity. And the assumption is it's going to change, and it's going to change probably to some, like, there's going to be a pattern towards it, I think, for every lifter. So for example, when I do block reviews with my clients, I always ask them, what do you want to hit? You want to do doubles? You want to do triples? You want to do fives? And it seems like a limited, it might even be too limited sometimes, because I kind of narrow them into this answer, like 5 to 1, what's our top set going to be? And it's also difficult to answer if you don't understand that you really can do anything. So it's important whenever you design a study if you do, or if I design it with my clients, to really give them a range and show them the options. Like, we can really do what you want here. Try to get as accurate as you can. And this idea is inspired because typically they tell me I'm still excited to do singles. I want to do singles again. I want to do a single at an 8. Let's do it for the 5th block in a row. And a part of that, I think, is on my end. I need to encourage them, like, it's okay if you don't want to do singles. There's not going to be, I need to be more on this, because I think this is the conclusion that I'm at right now. I don't think it matters what you choose in terms of net strength gains. But I think that the answer you choose has to be authentic towards where your psychological, physical stress is kind of in alignment with. Because, for example, I had a similar but inverse response to SIBA in 2 blocks ago. I had like my best squat block ever, where I finally gave myself like enough back off volume on my squat where it pushed the barrier of like, that might be too much. Because I mentioned I'm pretty conservative with my own training, and I did 4 sets of 6 at 70% after a single at an 8. Prior to that point, I was never doing more than like 2 back off sets on squat. But one of the like coaches in the team were like, how about you do 4 sets of 6 at 70%? I'm like, you know what? My squat hasn't moved in a while. Maybe it's the volume. So I added, and I had been doing, I think prior to that, I did a block with 6s only. So I ramped up to 6 at like an 8. So I switched from a 6 at an 8 to a single at an 8 and 4 sets of 6 at 70% of the daily estimated max. And my squat improved 30 kilos in 1 block. And I hit an all-time PR. I beat my meet PR, and I did it at my gym, my home gym, which is like the squat rack isn't even glued or like screwed into the ground. And there's also like a decline on the ramp, or like on the platform. It's not significant, but I feel it, and I feel like I have to kind of shift forward. Anyway, I was like, sweet, this is the protocol. My deadlift is part of my lower body. So if I do the same protocol for my deadlift, I'm going to get stronger. Now that I think about that, I didn't exactly do that protocol though. For some reason, I did a single at an 8 and then 4 triples at 85% of my max of my deadlift. And I was, in my head, I thought that's going to give me the gains. Like it's gotta, But what ended up happening was, so the next block I took the info and I tried to apply the same thing to my deadlift. And I literally lost 100 pounds on my deadlift in like 2 weeks. And I was like, I literally hit 550 last week for like a single at a 7.5. And this week I'm hitting 450 for like a single at an 8. What? And all the back off sets felt really hard. It was only 4 triples at like 80. I think it was like 80%, but it was like, this is hard. Actually, no, it was 77%. 4 triples at 77% of my estimated max for the day. And I reduced the same amount. Crazy hard. So I was really upset. And then I pivoted for like 2 weeks. I ran like a SEBA program that he wrote. It's like all bodybuilding, a bunch of machines. There's a bunch of new exercises I haven't done in a while. I'm like, man, this is so fun. Like, I don't hate myself afterwards. I left the gym with a smile. I have that like cardio level of like energy that you get once you hit like runner's high. And I'm like, this is really cool. Like, what if my training didn't make me want to hate myself for a block? Like, let's see what happens. And I'm currently testing it on myself because I don't know, but I tried to lean in that direction. And so I asked myself, what do I actually want to do? Like, not what is it that I think is going to like give me the most gains, even if I don't want to hit it. So what I did was I shifted from a single at an 8 to a triple at a 6 and a triple at an 8, followed by 3 sets of 7 at 70% on my deadlift. And so far, it's really enjoyable. I haven't been able to be consistent with it, but I'm hitting weights for sets of 7 that I was struggling with for triples in the previous, like literally the previous block. And so now I'm kind of applying that to my clients because I'm kind of understanding that even if the size principle isn't the reason for strength gains, like even if high volume training leading to growth into muscle mass isn't the reason that they get stronger in a potential like other block, maybe it's because that training is more fun for them psychologically, physically. They leave the gym better suited, and they don't doubt themselves. And so now they go and hit a single at one point and they kill it. I've had that already happen to my other lifters. I just haven't applied it to myself. And I'm really curious what happens. I'm in the middle of the block, and there's other variables too, but that is like the key one, is that I'm doing like triples at 6 and 8 on my squat and my deadlift. I'm having more fun with it. I'm hitting, similar levels of strength as my single, but I don't hate myself when I put the weight on my back.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of maximum effective intensity, it became an interesting idea for me because previous periodization models tried to predict or plan what the intensity is going to be for the lifter to elicit a certain response. But what if we could you mentioned periodization as just stress management, but the psychological stress might be a big key here. So what if every week or every 2 or every 3 weeks, the lifter gets a list of options for every exercise, and you just tell them to pick one of those based off of what they're excited about and see what happens. And I have no idea how studies are actually done, but I'm gonna try to do that for my lifters at some point when I get a really like excited, agreeable type lifter that will try anything. Yeah. I don't know what you think about that idea, and it's a long explanation for that, but I think that there'd be something like that which would be more applicable than like, what's your MRV? Because I think that changes way more often and is context dependent, but it's also difficult to test. Whereas you could easily test a maximum effective intensity and then base the rest of the program off of that. Or not, you need more questions, but you could test that hypothesis a little bit easier for a lifter. At least that's what I think.
Yeah. I think I like the idea a lot, actually. And I think the way you arrived there is really well thought out.
Thank you.
And it would be it'd be a cool study to run in a university, but you need a lot of people. And yeah. I think for that study, you also need you wouldn't want to do it with one exercise, because I think to test this, you need multiple exercises. So I think, yeah, I like it. And I was thinking when you were originally talking about your squat and the success you had with your squat, then you tried to replicate that in the deadlift initially. Was that the block following?
Yeah. So basically, I think I try to double down on that concept for my deadlift. I'm gonna pull it up so I can be specific, and then I'll just edit the time it takes for me to figure out what. Because it was only like two months ago.
Yeah.
Because my block length is like 4 weeks, so I get to test a lot of things. But that's also one of the limitations to the bottom up approach, is that once I find something that works, I have no idea how long it's going to work.
Yeah.
And especially for my clients, that's one of the biggest limitations, because I don't know how excited I can be when a protocol works. And then, I mean, and this might be another episode concept for us, but that is probably the biggest thing. It's like, if everything can work, then how much should we change from block to block? And how do we elicit more growth from block to block once we found some form of training approach that works? Because, and then that's where I got to this idea of the maximum effective intensity concept. Because if there's some psychological and physiological logical threshold for the lifter, maybe that can be the answer for how much needs to change. Because, and again, you have to ensure that the lifter doesn't feel forced to an answer. Like, you have to, like, really, there is a lot we can do. Just tell me what you're thinking. We can change a lot. And so you need to kind of teach the lifter for a while the creative options that they have. But that's kind of where I struggle in general, is what happens after success.
Yeah. I have another train of thought, and this is really super hypothetical and perhaps too far out there, but you PR'd in your squat, right? I wonder if that has a not a ripple effect, so to speak, but and Sebastian knows I like this idea. Sometimes I wonder if one adaptation comes at the cost of another adaptation. Meaning, did that success in your squat, is that the reason your deadlift was not compromised, but that you didn't have the same success? So does all that adaptation that went into making you, was that like a 30 kilogram PR?
Yeah, it's a 30 kilo PR.
That's significant, right? So did that stress, is that stress and that success, is that the reason? And it may not be at all, but sometimes I think about, the interplay of adaptation, and when you're trying to get good at more than one thing at a time, what's the consequence of that? So, like, would your deadlift have been more likely to increase if your squat had only increased 15 kilograms?
So I actually have the graph to show you what happened, and I also have the protocols near it. So there are people that think and have verbalized that there is no point in doing speed work or whatever. Like, there's no benefit you get from a technical perspective from doing low intensity training. And the like trump card that I play is that there's literal data indicating that purely visualizing your technique can yield a positive improvement in performance. Whether that's they have it in weightlifting. There's a study in weightlifting where they do visualization training, or imagery, I guess they call it, and there's a positive improvement in training. So how is it that you cannot even touch load and experience improvements in technique, but physically moving like 70% of your max has no benefit on technique? Because, and I don't know why I get ranty on this, but it's like, how? You're doing the movement that you're supposed, it's just lighter. Like, you can't learn anything from that. It seems unlikely.
Yeah, I think that's just, someone doesn't like them and they decide they don't need them, but that doesn't mean that they can't serve a purpose or be a substitute for something else, right? And I think that's just an example of people playing flags, which is never wise to do, I don't think.
Yeah. And the last thing on that point too is, I think, especially with what I was showing in my training, and I think, Siba, you've demonstrated this, I think there is utility in knowing the difference between what a set of 8 out of 7 feels like and what a single or a double or whatever feels like. And there may be a certain period where a lifter, and I can be wrong about all this, I'm fine with it. If some, maybe everyone needs to do singles all the time or whatever. But I think once you can, like, visualize and like, when you close your eyes, you think, oh man, a single out of 8 on my deadlift feels like this. Like, if you can, once it's like in your brain, how it feels because you've done it enough times where it's like, oh yeah, that's what it's going to feel heavy. And I know what that means. I'm not currently convinced that you need to continuously test that technique to get better at the higher intensity. Like the subtle technical deviations from the high intensity training, I think are important to understand, but they don't need to be tested once they're understood if the lifter doesn't want to test them and still yield positive outcomes from that intensity when tested. Does that make sense? And I could be wrong, but that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely something that science can't answer, and I think you guys are more poised to offer thoughts on that. But I would imagine that we just don't know. We don't know how often it's necessary because none of the research shows that it is. We just show that it's similar to doing something that's much less, right? So like the strongest conclusion that I could ever have with passion is, well, in this circumstance, doing way less load for way more reps was the same as doing heavy singles. And that's the extent of what we know. And then off that, we can infer that some exposure might be necessary. We don't know how often is absolutely necessary. And you're always going to wonder, did what I do, like, did that maximize strength? Because we don't all have an identical twin going through the same program with the minor tweaks it would take to know, could it have been better?
Yeah.
But I would imagine it doesn't have to be super frequent. I think there is some value to practicing that skill for sure. And but then as we mentioned before, how close do you have to actually get? Because you're never going to replicate a competition scenario in the gym anyway. You can try, right? But it's and maybe you don't want to take, especially as people get stronger and stronger and stronger. What's the risk of expressing your true strength, and why would you risk that on any other day than competition? And so I think all those things have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and Siba and I have talked about well, actually, I have the book right here. I don't know if you've read it. It's called Agile Periodization. This book.
I haven't read that one, no.
By Mladen Jovanovic. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But I mean, there's nothing like mind blowing in the book, but it's a different take on bottom up training, and one that I'm really broke my brain because I have such a linear approach with it. And we can wrap this up, but the last point I have is like kind of reiterating what you're saying. When we're making decisions as coaches and then as clients kind of receiving the training, it's kind of like wondering if you made the right choice with your significant other. It's like there could be a person that might be better in your life for you, but like, are you not getting what you want out with the people that are in your life? You know, and what's the consequence? Because you could be wrong. Everyone else might be the worst person for you. You know, it's like, what's the consequence of doing something different? It could have gone, you could have gotten injured and now you can't train for 5 months. And I think that's when I've had lifters that are like, I see Joe, and I see the flex team, they're doing a lot more volume and they're getting wicked strong. So like, I'm going to go try that. And I think you should be free to do what you want to try. But I think that's why I'm more conservative, because maybe you could maximize it by doing a little bit more, but you're on the threshold now. You might be on the line there.
Yeah, I think that I think I agree for the most part. And what was I going to say? I lost the thought I had because my dog keeps barking. But oh goodness, I just lost my train of thought.
Maybe if I say it again.
Yeah, say it, it'll come back to me.
Yeah. So
say the Spark Notes version of it, though. I can.
Yeah, the Spark Notes is the alternative reality in a training could be either that you get injured, or you're out of training and you're always kind of searching or looking for, was this the best decision I could have made today? And I just, like you mentioned, it's pretty much impossible to know if that's a thing, because you don't have a split test version of you. And the other thing is, if there's more autonomy, like if there's a collaborative process with the training development, I think it minimizes that thought a little bit, because there's almost a cognitive dissonance that may occur between. Did we lose him? Dr. Buckner, are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I lost you on the screen. But there might be like some cognitive dissonance if there's more of a collaborative nature of the program development. And that's why I really like to be collaborative in that in the training design, because I feel like if the lifter feels like that was the best decision when we made it 5 weeks ago,
Yeah.
then maybe they won't start questioning like me, but more like we're the process never ends. Like that question never ends, no matter what you try. So if you want to try something new, communicate that with me, because we can do it. But the big thing is, if you're training and you're doing your thing, the negative outcome that you didn't experience might be ignored, because you think that the other outcomes are always better.
Yeah. I think that's just one of those things that you only have so much control, and you're trying to control so many variables, and then you're trying to attribute your success or your failure to what was it, right? And I think often it's really difficult to know what to point to, and it's nearly impossible to know if things could have been better over the same period of time. And I guess that's one of the reasons I enjoy science, is we attempt to create a controlled environment where we can make the tiniest manipulation and see if that tiny manipulation has a meaningful effect. And as we've talked about this entire time, that translation to what you all care about might be minimal, but I think it helps us get at that idea of, we'll try our best to optimize what we can, knowing what we know, and evaluate after the fact and during, make adjustments. But I don't think you'll necessarily always know, what can we do moving forward to optimize. I think it's more of to some extent, a guessing game. Let's try this and see how we respond, and then let's tweak it a little bit more and see how we respond. And I think that the collaborative nature is important throughout, and I think not being super rigid in our ideology of what is absolutely necessary, I think is going to be really helpful.
I think Steve mentioned yesterday, or like last week, like our whole thing at ZAO Strength is like anti-ideology, because we're probably going to be wrong anyway. So what's the point?
I've learned I'm almost always wrong. And you guys probably notice I hardly ever plant a flag unless it's just a foundational principle, because and even a lot of scientific communicators, they plant several flags, and my experience is just, it isn't like that. Like, we have what we think we kind of understand right now, and certainly if we did the same podcast in 1 year's time, a lot of that's going to change. And it's not that we were wrong. It's that our best interpretation at that moment was just as good as it could be in that moment. Which is, I love that about this, honestly. I think it's part of the passion is trying to tease out what seems to be good at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I have like a lot more I want to ask you, but I also don't want to take more of your time or bore the viewers, because we have a Q&A that's way longer. I haven't got to any like the specific questions that I'm curious about. But if you're available, we could do more of these, because I don't think people are making podcasts like this. I also think that I want to make it clear to the audience that I get really excited when I have a new idea that I'm trying, mostly because there's, if it's like a counterculture kind of like energy, seeing that there's an alternate way of approaching things and then being proven right is really exciting because I think, like you mentioned, there's not only researchers planting flags, there's coaches planting flags, there's high level athletes planting flags. And ultimately, that can form a really messed up interpretation of what is reality for the new or average or, maybe future competitive athlete who's trying to get strong. But the flags that are being planted all around them make it feel like it's really, there's only one way to do it. And if that way doesn't work for you, then you're lesser, you're not built, you don't have the genetics, whatever the thing is. Or it leads to injury. And I know the injury is complicated and a whole nother thing, but yeah, that's the reason for the energy. Cause it's like, man, there's so much we can try. And it's, we don't, like you mentioned, we don't even have the answers for how do we get strong. That's crazy.
Yeah, and I think I listen to so many podcasts where they have all the answers on how we get stronger, and like the more I read, the less I'm confident, and which isn't a bad thing because I think it's good to be cautious and just I would really like to know, but I would be foolish to pretend that I do completely understand a lot of these things, and I think the more interesting discussion most of the time. If we're talking about people who have planted flags, it's more deconstruct. Okay, why did their program work? Why did their athletes succeed? Right? And you can probably point to a few things that likely help explain it. But then you could have someone doing something totally different, and again, their reason for it is probably just something that's super marketable. When the reason it worked is probably just a way more simplistic answer. And when you're working with strong, gifted athletes and you're lifting weights, there's so many ways that are probably going to get them there. It's a complex process, but physiology can typically answer at least some of it and help us understand the components that seem to be helpful along the way.
Well, Steve, do you have anything else you want to add?
I don't think so.
Cool. Well, Dr. Buckner, I appreciate you being on here. This has been awesome. I would love to do more episodes because most of the questions that I have that we haven't kind of gone over are like specific questions about muscle physiology and like kind of the hypertrophy side of things. And I know you have a lot of experience with that too. So yeah, thank you for being here, and we'll see everyone in the next episode.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for having me.